All right, so it's good to see everybody for a return of the Tanya Tuesday. We shall see if we do next week. There's a wedding, so we'll see if we can pull that off. I was going to be in Israel this Tuesday, so this is a bonus class that you get. Wasn't originally on my schedule. So there is a war in Israel, of course, and therefore we want to dedicate our um, class the safety and security of everybody in the land of Israel, and the safety and success of the American and Israeli armies and all of their soldiers and Air Force men and women, and everybody who's there should be safe and should be very, very successful. All right, so with that, let us hop into over here. So we've been having discussions over the last couple of weeks of the balance of having reverence for God, the balance of having love for God. And this chapter started off with the note that the most important thing, Reishis Avoda Vika Basharsha, the beginning and the foundation of all service of God, is awe, fear, acceptance of God's authority. Because without that, it is not a service of God. And so the best way to do that is to meditate about God. And then from your meditation, you come to a great deep understanding. And then from the great deep understanding, you come to a great feeling. However, we discussed last week, there's a possibility that someone will not be able to reach to their feelings. Okay. However, there is what's called emotional feelings, and then there's mind feelings. Now, the mind doesn't really have feelings, but what we mean by that is like the mind.
I think he froze.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say the frozen.
Oops.
Well, there was a
There,
second.
now he's over there. Now there's two of you. Okay.
Let's spotlight myself. Oh, I don't know if it is still recording. What happened over here is I have the plug for my computer just came out. So
That's what happened.
it is what it is. I hope I'm still spotlighted.
Yeah.
You were talking about the mind
Yeah,
feelings
do you
from
see
the
me? Do you see me spotlighted or the other me spotlighted?
I see the new
I-
you.
we
The
see
new
you.
you. The new you.
You see the new me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good I can refresh myself. Yeah. So I'll get the computer up in a moment, but yes. So there is emotional feelings. Of course, we are all familiar with that, but there's also what people don't realize there's a mind feeling. And a mind feeling is not the emotional feeling of the heart, but maybe call like the wow of the mind, like the mind being very impressed. Um, there are many people out there who actually don't realize that they're not emotional because they just kind of have the emotions in their brain, which is a possibility as well. And they don't realize that they're not really tapping into their heart's emotions. Okay. So the Tanya is now going to talk because the Alter Rebbe is very in tune with people and their emotions. He's going to talk about, all right, last week we spoke about if someone delves deeply in their mind is wowed, but their heart is not wowed. This week he's going to talk about what if your mind doesn't even get excited, right? What if your mind still remains stoic? Is that considered a service of God? Because we can understand if you put your best effort forward in your heart, then your mind is, if you put your best effort forward, here, I'm going to switch 1 second. So we understand that if you put your best effort forward, that let me hit this AI companion. We understand that if you put your best effort forward, then we can't really blame you. But the problem here is that, I'm just scared, I'm moving too much. Problem here is that you're not even experiencing a mind excitement. And that's a problem because where is your service? The question, because the problem is you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of fearing God, right? In other words, in addition to serving God, we need to fear God, right? There's a mitzvah to love God and to fear God, right? And you're not experiencing a fear of God. So what do we do in such a case? So let's take a look here inside. So he says like this. He says, let's take a look. In the previous section of the Tanya stressed that full service of God requires both acceptance of God's authority and reverence, because one is service of God and one is fear or reverence of God, which is a mitzvah in itself. But what if you manage with one without the other? Your meditation brings you to a basic acceptance of God's authority, but you cannot manage to feel any reverence even in your mind. Okay, so he says, now, even if after the above meditative practice, you can't feel any sense of reverence or shame to be in the presence of God, even in your mind and thoughts, due to the poor quality of your soul, which was carved out from its source in the lowest level of the 10 spirits of the world of Asiyah. This goes back to chapter 4. The longer, so to speak, your soul waits in the gestational period, that's the period where your soul goes from being a piece of God to becoming more of a created being. The longer it stays in that gestative state, the harder it is for you to feel spiritual, because your soul is, so to speak, more developed. And more developed means more ego, more separateness. So even if we attribute your failure to generate any feelings of reverence to weak soul powers, that still doesn't absolve you of the problem. If reverence is required for full service and you can't muster any reverence at all, where does that leave your service? So then, and he says, nevertheless, even in the absence, we'll get to the question soon. Nevertheless, even in the absence of any sense of emotional mental reverence, since your worship is done with the intention to serve the King of the universe and not for your self-gratification, it's an intact worship. I'm going to read the next two lines, then I'll explain what he means. With Kabbalat Ol, accepting God's yoke, and reverence, phase 1 and 2, your worship is full, but with Kabbalat Ol, with just accepting God as king, it's merely intact. It's not lacking any disqualifying quality. This seems to be at odds with our thinking throughout the chapter, which has stressed the importance of reverence. So now the Tanya clarifies, because in enumerating the 613 commandments, reverence and service are counted as two separate mitzvahs, two separate commandments, and therefore the failure in one does not invalidate the other. So he's making a point here. He's making a point here. If you completely fail to generate any feeling of reverence to God, even in your mind, yes, you may be losing the mitzvah of reverence of God, but you still are fulfilling the mitzvah of serving God, as long as you are doing the mitzvah to serve God. Now, if you're doing the mitzvah not even to serve God, then you're not even serving God. You're missing that mitzvah, okay? But his point here is, if all you can manage is a feeling of, accepting God as king, serving God, and no feeling of reverence to God at all, then you're fulfilling one mitzvah, not the other. Okay, so you are missing out on one mitzvah, but you are doing another mitzvah. This is important because a lot of times we might feel like we don't even, some of us don't ever work on reverence, okay, or not too often. And his point here is in the Tanya, one must work on reverence because it is a mitzvah, but also know that if you don't manage reverence, if you at the very least know that you're serving God, you are fulfilling one mitzvah, which is service. So in other words, there's two things. There's service of God and there is reverence of God. Let me just read the next two lines, then I'll take questions. Jewish legal texts indicate that service, which is based on Kabbalah, accepting the yoke of heaven, and reverence, phase 2, are two separate requirements. And that's why your service remains intact even in the absence of reverence. Okay, so questions. Nina, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure I have it right because it's an idea that I have that I understand, but I didn't know that there was a Torah kind of perspective. So in other words, the more the intellect is developed, the more ego and the more separation from God.
The more the intellect is developed, the more ego and separation from God. Um, so I was referring to the soul. Soul in its essence is pure. The more a soul becomes developed before it comes into your body, the more separate it will naturally feel from God. So I don't know if that really necessarily depends on whether you are smart or not
Why
smart.
would the development of your soul separate you from God?
Sounds funny, right? Because unlike a child being born where you want it to be more developed to be healthier, in this case, the more developed you are, the more different you are from your original source. If your original source is pure, the more your soul, quote unquote, develops, the farther away it is from its original state, which is very much subsumed within God's
Gotcha.
glory.
I got it. Yep. Like they
Okay.
say, like, I know it's okay, it's another spiritual practice, whatever, but it says that you'll only get into heaven if you're like a child. I don't know if we have in our in our religion anything similar, but
We have a statement when it comes to prayer. It says, we say, Ani mispalel al das ze'atinik. I am praying like a little child. In other words, as we grow our spirituality, we become very complex beings and we understand God in all different ways. But sometimes we need to remind ourselves we need to pray to God like a child's very pure faith in God. So that's what it says in the Jewish text. If that helps you. Um, but yeah, it's an interesting point. It talks that we spoke about it in chapter two. You can watch the recordings over there, the second half of chapter two. But this whole idea is that the more a soul is developed in heaven, the farther it is from God. And that's what a righteous person is. A righteous person is someone whose soul is not so developed. It's more natural. Okay. The rest of our souls get more developed in order to interact with this world. But a tzaddik, a righteous person, their souls are quote unquote not developed, which is actually a better thing. They're much more connected to their original state of being, which is a piece of God. Yeah. Okay, so and so it's possible if your soul got very developed, okay, the longer it was cooking, so to speak, you're gonna have a lot more trouble to feel God because your natural ability for spirituality is much harder. It means you're much more physical, ego, and so your ability to break out of that shell is much harder. That's how it is. All right, so his first point here was if you work on reverence of God and you cannot even manage even any excitement in your mind. Don't feel too, obviously, we would like excitement at the very least in the mind, but number one, you should know even if you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of reverence, you can fulfill the other mitzvah of service of God, which is knowing that you're doing it because God asked you to. This is just a general Chabad philosophy, which you probably hear from Chabadniks all the time. Like, just because you can't do one thing doesn't mean you shouldn't do the other thing, right? Just because you can't sit in the sukkah doesn't mean you shouldn't shake the lulav and etrog. Just because you can't do the whole Shabbos doesn't mean you shouldn't do part of Shabbos. In all different areas, it's not a all or nothing. Every moment of connection to God, any mitzvah you can do is precious in its own right. And so we see that here in the Tanya here, is that just because you cannot get reverence, you don't get that mitzvah, doesn't mean you should lose it on the other mitzvah. That's one point, which is a general Chabad uh, value and viewpoint that we, leads a lot into our outreach. But here the Tanya is going to add another point, is that he's gonna make the argument that in truth, you do actually have some level of reverence. There is some level of reverence. So let's read on. Let's read on over here. Now he says like this. He says, now the Tanya will argue that even in the absence of emotional or mental reverence of God, there's likely to be some sort of respect for God at the very least, which could qualify as a very minimal level of reverence. And he says, what's more, even if you just have Kabbalah, accepting the yoke of heaven, and fail to feel any reverence in your mind, you will in fact fulfill the minimal biblical requirement of reverence so long as you have a basic feeling of respect towards God. Let's go to the next page. So how is it reverence? This minimal reverence consists of your conscious awareness that at the least during this specific moment when you're observing the mitzvah, you respectful of God at least as much as you would be respectful of an ordinary human being, not a king who's watching you. Since even when being watched by a human being that you respect, you'd refrain from doing something that he found inappropriate. This basic respect is considered fulfillment of the basic biblical requirement of reverence. So here's making an argument that, like he says here, let me read this. We're speaking here about an inappropriate act, which if nobody was watching, you would have done, or a good deed, which if nobody was watching, you wouldn't have bothered to do. The mere presence of a respectable onlooker is enough to motivate you to behave appropriately. If you can respect God at least as much as that, then even in a very minimal way, you fulfill the mitzvah of revere God, your God. So he's making the argument, even if you cannot feel any excitement or you don't feel the awesomeness of God, right? You're not feeling the true full amount of what God is, right? You're not feeling that, we said earlier, you should meditate about God, how he's the source of all the worlds and he vivifies everything. I mean, that should bring you to some type of emotional or mental excitement. But even if you cannot reach any of that, the fact that you have an awareness of God gives you a certain level of reverence. What does reverence mean? Reverence means, at the most basic level, is that the presence of that person is causing you to act differently. Okay? Now, even if you don't view God as God in his fullest sense, if you just view him even as another respectable human being that was there, there's some reverence to be had. We all know ourselves that there are certain things that we wouldn't do when people are watching, right? There's a concept in politics called a hot mic, right? When they think nobody's listening and they're caught on camera, or they're caught on video on a microphone saying something, right? In other words, if they would have been aware that people were watching, they wouldn't have done it, right? Whether it's curse words or whatever else they're saying, right? It's called a hot mic, and usually means, oh, that's what they really think. You know what I mean? But we have the same thing in our lives. There's a story in the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan, who was one of the greatest sages, he was on his deathbed. He told his students, and we're going to read this story in a moment, but I'm telling it to you outside. You know what? Let's read it inside. Why not? Let's read the story. So Rabbi Yochanan is one of the greatest sages. He was on his deathbed and listened to his parting message to his students. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan Mizaka said to his students as a blessing on his deathbed, "May it be God's will that you revere heaven as much as you revere humans." And his students said, I mean, you can imagine the students, their teacher is dying. His parting message is you should fear God like you fear another human being. God is much more than that. You know what he said? If only, he says, I wish you would at least fear God like you fear another human being. He says, because you should know that when a person commits a transgression, he says, I hope nobody sees me. In other words, yeah, you all think you're so big and you're all big, students of Rabbi Yochanan and you're all so wise. And he says, if you could even manage for your entire life to fear God like you fear another human being, you'd be doing pretty good. In other words, if you were always aware, if you always know you have a human being walking around with you, recording you, there's so many things you're not going to do. And so Rabbi Yochanan was telling them, before you get ahead of yourself, let's start with the most basic thing. Just recognize that God is watching. There was another famous story that goes around. I forget which Hasidic Rebbe it was with, but he once took a farmer. A farmer took him on a trip. He paid the farmer to take him somewhere, the wagon driver. And along the way, the farmer told this tzaddik, this righteous man, he says, listen, I gotta feed my horse. I'm gonna go have my horse eat from the field over here. Where was a cow? I don't know what it was. So the horse starts to eat, and the farmer told him, this is someone else's field. If you see anybody watching, just let me know. So they go off to the side, and right away the tzaddik says, someone's watching. And so the farmer jumps in. They start traveling really fast, and he's looking behind. He doesn't see anything, cops, nothing. He asks the rabbi, he says, tell me, who was watching? He says, God was watching, right? God was watching. In other words, that's the idea, is if we can even have the most basic reverence of God to the point that someone is watching, even if we don't appreciate God as God, that is a level of reverence. So this is his second argument. If you are accepting God as your king, or you're accepting the yoke of heaven, the reason why you're doing the mitzvah is because God asked you, which we said earlier is service, not reverence, right? Reverence should be a feeling. He makes the argument still, nevertheless, since at that moment you know that God is watching, that alone is a certain level of reverence. Even if you're not excited over God as God, but just knowing that God is watching, that alone can be classified as a certain level of reverence. So his point here is, that's why he started the chapter, accepting the yoke of heaven, accepting to listen to God. and that God is watching, that alone contains service of God and reverence of God. And if we can manage even just that, we have the most basic level of service and reverence that is required. And again, this is a powerful idea because so many of us do have trouble with the either the time to spend to feel God's presence or the wherewithal, the spiritual wherewithal to always be excited about God. And so we need to know, as this chapter says, the most basic beginning of serving God is to recognize that God is watching, and He wants to, and He asks, and He's asking you to either do this mitzvah or not do that sin. That's the let's take a look. They have here on the sidebar, they have practical lessons, which it's always good to buy this Tanya, the practical Tanya. So he says here, if you have Kabbalah all accepting the yoke of heaven, even if you don't feel reverence for God, even in your mind, then your worship is intact. If you feel reverence too, your worship is full. But without Kabbalah all accepting the yoke of heaven, you're not really serving God at all. That was our argument in the beginning. If you don't feel reverence for God, even in your mind, but you observe the mitzvah simply because you feel He's watching you, that counts as reverence. That's a sum up of what we've said till now. Okay? All right, so that is the story of reverence. Now he's going to move on to love. Love is something we touched upon a couple times, and he's going to touch upon it again. And because he's laid down the foundation, how important reverence is, and what a most minimal reverence is, he's also going to let us know that we need to have love. In other words, he's spent a whole chapter explaining why reverence is so important and why love is not enough. So he needs to say now, but don't think that you don't need love. Just because I've focused and I've told you that you need to have reverence doesn't mean you don't need to have love. Okay, love is also very important because there are two wings. There are the two wings of every single mitzvah, the two wings that help it fly high to heaven. Without two wings, it's missing the ability to fly up to heaven. So what does love add over reverence?
Feeling.
Feeling, yeah. The mitzvah becomes, otherwise it could be a very dry mitzvah, right? So it gives it life. It gives it life, vitality, and it gives it the ability to have a deep effect on the world around you. The reverence kind of connects it to God, and the love makes it full of the feeling of God, if you want to put it that way. What's interesting is that they're opposite feelings, love and reverence. So the ability to have both when you do a mitzvah is hard. In fact, Tanya says elsewhere, it says, Osa, I think it's actually quoted originally from a Medrash. The Medrash says, Osa shalom b'mrova. Maybe it's the Zohar. Osa shalom b'mrova. God makes, right? We say every single day at the end of our prayers, Osa shalom b'mromov. He who makes peace in heaven. Hu yasa shalom aleinu. He makes peace upon us. V'al kol Yisrael, and on all the Jewish people. V'imru amen. Let us say amen. Right. So ever wonder what does it mean? Osa shalom b'mromov. He who makes peace in heaven. I mean, is there the problems in heaven? I mean, it's heaven. There shouldn't be any problems. I mean, we understand that here on this earth we don't get along, but what's going on in heaven? The answer is that there's not a war necessarily, but there are different factions of angels. There are angels who serve God with more reverence, and there are angels that serve God with more love. And naturally, they cannot get along. As the Tanya says elsewhere, it's like asking fire and water to get along. All right, even if they're not fighting over like petty things like we fight over here, but naturally they don't go together. How can they work together? And the Tanya answers, Osa shalom b'mroma. When they both recognize that they're serving God, then they learn to get along. And the example that Tanya gives is like you can have two generals who have very, very different viewpoints and very different styles, but if they're working for the same king, they learn how to get along. Or let's say different departments in the government, right? Let's say you have a department that's job is to save money, and another department's job is to find out where to spend money. They have to learn to get along. Uh, is there a department to save money? No, okay. So that's the idea, is you can have different factions in the same government that are very different, but when they recognize they have a shared common goal, then they learn to get along. Same thing in any organization. You can have employees who have very different styles, very different mannerisms, very different opinions. Now, if they're full of themselves, they will not be able to get along. But if they feel how they are there to serve the business, then they will learn to get along because they have a shared common goal. Tanya makes the same argument as our ability to have love and reverence at the same time is only in the service of God. In the service of God, we can have both feelings together because it is both to serve God. In the presence of God, both the feelings can go together. Generally, they don't go together. Either you're afraid or you love. But over here, there's an ability to have both at the same time. Anybody had a question over here? Not that, well, we're going to read this inside. Okay. So let's read. It says here, so far in this chapter, we learned that acceptance of God's authority is necessary for your worship to be considered some sort of service. For your worship to be considered full service, it also requires a feeling of reverence. This reverence should ideally be felt in the heart, though if it is felt in the mind, that's acceptable. In fact, even basic awareness that someone is watching you from above is considered reverence. But then he continues, so that was a sum of what we said till now today. Only this reverence, meaning all the different levels we have been discussing in this chapter, would fall under the category of lower reverence. As we will discuss at length in chapter 43, there are two very different experiences of reverence which can be reached at different stages in your spiritual maturity. Everything we have discussed in this chapter would fall under the category of lower reverence, the general awareness of God's presence that prompts you to observe His Torah and commandments. And lower reverence falls under the category of the reverence necessary to not sin, which precedes wisdom Torah. But higher reverence is a reverence arising from a sense of shame in God's presence. Again, it's more chapter 43, so we're not going to delve into it deeply, but he says, at the lower reverence, you feel the presence of God to the extent that you are eager to fill His will. At the higher reverence, your sense of His presence is more arresting. You are simply overwhelmed by Him. In other words, at lower reverence, you revere His will. At higher reverence, you revere God Himself. Tanya brings proof from the Zohar there are two categories of reverence. For there's reverence and then there's reverence of a different kind. This was all a sidebar. He's just telling you should just know, we spoke about reverence at length. You should know there's a higher level of reverence. We're going to talk about it later. But now we're going to return back to our idea that I just presented to you. But now he says, but in the absence of any reverence at all, your mitzvah will not soar heavenward with love alone. Because you need both love and reverence. That's why it's so important. This chapter is telling you, though there are many layers of reverence, you need to make sure you maintain at least the most basic level of reverence. Just as a bird cannot fly without with one wing, reverence and love being the two wings, as the Tikkun Zohar states above. But the reverse is also true. Despite the very fundamental need for reverence that we have explored in this chapter, if there is no love accompanying your mitzvah, it will be grounded. And the same is true if your mitzvah is performed with reverence alone, it will not soar heavenward. For even though reverence alone is sufficient for your worship to be called work of a loyal servant, you must also worship God at the level of a loving child, see above. This goes back to what we mentioned in previous classes, Avinu Malkeinu, right? We say in the prayers, our Father, our King. And we have to relate to God at both layers. Our King is the reverence. Our Father is the love. Okay? We're not talking about the very scary red Father. We're talking about the Father that you love. As with reverence, if meditation doesn't produce any love in the heart, a feeling in the mind is acceptable. And by the way, he's going to talk in later chapters more at length of the different layers of love. Here, this chapter is mostly about fear, but he wants to tell you while he's spending so much time on fear, don't skip in the love. And he's also going to tell you should know, explain it later more, but you should know that just like in this chapter, a level of love, reverence in the mind is enough. A level of love in the mind is enough. You need to at least awaken an inherent love which is dormant in your heart, and even if you don't feel it in your heart, it should at least be conscious of your mind, that you call to mind your love for the one God and your desire to connect with Him. While the Tikkun Zohar stipulates that a mitzvah can't rise heavenwards without two wings of reverence and love, the Tanya considers a feeling of reverence and love in your mind to be sufficient. Okay? And practically speaking, the feeling of love should be that with each act of Torah study and mitzvah observance, you have the following intention, the following kavanah. What intention should it be? That you desire to connect your divine and energizing animal souls together with their garments to God, as stated above. Love is a feeling of wanting to come close. In the case of a mitzvah, it means that your whole being embraces and becomes absorbed in God. So here he explained, what does love mean? Love means that you want to get close to God. That's why we started off the chapter, we said you needed reverence, because in a sense, love can be a little selfish. Love can be about your personal desires, your desire to want to be close to God. So though on the one hand, love in our service of God gives a very powerful feeling of connection and makes the mitzvah alive, if you just had love and no awe, the mitzvah could be much more about yourself and not about God. So we need the balance. On the one hand, we need reverence so that the mitzvah is about God. On the other hand, we need love so that the mitzvah has an energizing force to it. And that's what this section warned us, is that even though we've spent so much time explaining reverence of God, it's also important to know that we need to have a love of God. And just as in reverence, if your heart cannot get excited, if at least your mind is excited, that's enough. The same thing applies in love. If your heart cannot get excited, if at least your mind gets excited, that should be enough. One important point I want to add from this last section is that there's a story. I'll say what the story. The story was one time Rabbi Hanina ben Tradian, one of the sages of the Talmud, asked Rabbi Yossi. He asked him, "Am I going to get reward in the world to come?" Now, Rabbi Hanina was one of the 10 martyrs of the Romans. So he was obviously a very holy guy if he was chosen to be one of the martyrs. Yet, nevertheless, he was asking of his teacher, "Do you think I'm fitting for the world to come?" So you know what his teacher told him? His teacher didn't tell him for sure. His teacher asked him, he said, "Tell me something good that you've done." And so he explained to him how there was a time that even though he didn't have to, he gave charity. Lengthy story, it's not important. And so then his teacher told him, aha, if that's the case, then you deserve the world to come. You deserve the world to come. So the question on the story is, why? Because he gave charity when he didn't have to. What did that have to do with anything? And the answer is, the Alter Rebbe answers that there are two types of people in the world. Sorry, everyone has different natures. And Rabbi Yossi knew that him giving that charity was against his nature. Maybe he was a big Torah scholar, maybe he did certain things, but for him, charity was against his nature. And so when he heard that he gave charity beyond the norm, that told him that this is somebody who serves God. And that's really the idea here, is that some of us more naturally drift to reverence of God. And for us to serve God would mean to add in love of God, because that's not natural to us. And some of us are more natural in loving God. And for us, service of God would mean reverence of God. We need to have the two sides. Really, the point is to serve God is to go against your nature, right? Because if you just follow your nature, then you could be self-serving. So it is possible someone has reverence of God, but they're actually not. It's their nature. They're very I don't want to say depressed by nature, but they're very more of the obedient. I don't know. It's just their nature, right? They love the scariness. And for such a person to awaken love of God would be a great way to serve God. So this is just an important thing, is that in general in life, there are times where God will ask of us in different moments of our life to do the opposite of our nature. And we naturally don't like it because it's not our nature, right? So maybe let's say you're a rabbi, you have to fundraise. No, but not, it's not your nature, but that's part of what your job, part of what you have to do. It's part of your mission in life. Everybody in every job they do has parts of it they like, parts of it they don't like. But if you want to be successful in the job market, you have to be able to do things that you don't like that generally service what you're doing. And the same thing is in serving God. Much more, of course, lahavdil. If we want to be serving God, there are times when we have to be willing to go against our nature. That's this balance that we're talking about over here between love and reverence. Is some people will love the reverence, will hate the love. Some people, or not hate the love, but love is not their thing, and vice versa. And this is important again to think in general. There are many commandments that some that we really enjoy, some that we really connect with, and there are some that we don't connect with so much. And this is the job of service of God, serving God, which is what the whole Tanya is trying to teach you. How do you serve God? Is to pull through, even in the areas where it's not natural to you. Maybe you love the holiday Sukkot, but Passover you're not feeling so much, or maybe you feel the holiday Passover, Shavuot you don't feel, or maybe Yom Kippur you don't feel Shabbat. The test of God to us is, can we serve Him when we don't naturally enjoy it? And that can change over time. Sometimes whatever we didn't enjoy before, we enjoy now, but now there's new things we don't enjoy. And to truly serve God is to serve Him in areas that are not natural to us. Any questions or comments? No? Okay. I thought that was a pretty heavy topic over there. It's a pretty important point. But okay, nobody has any questions. It means it's clear enough. All right, now we're going to go on to a fascinating idea. We touched upon it in previous classes, but we're going to explain.
I do have a question, but I
You have a
couldn't unmute
question? Okay.
fast enough. Yeah. You're saying that it's unnatural, but I thought that when we go to our deepest, truest essence in our soul, that it is natural.
Good question. So you're saying, how can I say it's not natural if at our deepest, truest essence, um, that is who we are. We have both love and reverence of God, right?
Yes.
So the answer is, even within souls, we spoke about the gestational period of souls, right? We spoke about how souls, as they go through the more processing, the farther, so to speak, the less spiritual they naturally are. So also souls can come from, right? God has the 10 sefirot. Different souls will be more rooted in one of those 10 sefirot. So you can have a soul that is more rooted on the side of love, and you can have a soul that is more rooted on the side of reverence. So you're right. Yes, if you dig deep enough, you will find both. But you more naturally gravitate to one or the other, either love or reverence of God, based on your soul's gestation as it comes down to this earth, and which one of the 10 sefirot it is more rooted in. We say that Beit Shammai, right? Everyone knows Beit Shammai was generally more strict, and Beit Hillel was generally more lenient in Torah law. It says that actually has to do with the root of their souls. That one of their souls was more rooted in kindness, and one of their souls was rooted more in judgment.
How
And
is that
that's why
decided? How does Hashem decide that?
I leave it up to him. We get what we get. I don't know. He has a master plan. Why some souls are more rooted in love, why some souls are more rooted in reverence, or any of the other 10 sefirot. Okay, but they all fall in those two general categories. Though there is a middle beam which is more mixed. So I can't answer the question how God decides what soul you get, but I do know that He does decide that we get different souls. Okay, a very good question. Okay, so now if you're naturally spiritually inclined one way or the other, it could totally be the root of your soul and where how God created your soul as it came down to this earth. Okay. Um so let's go to the next story. I'll start off with a joke. So a guy goes on a date and he comes back, and so the parents ask the date, knew how was the date? "No, it was okay." So they ask him, "It didn't bother you that he's not very sanitary, doesn't brush her teeth?" "No, it didn't bother me." He says, "Didn't bother you that she has a foul mouth? She says all horrible things?" "No, it doesn't bother me." They said, it didn't bother you that she has this big scar that goes across her face?" He says, "No, it didn't bother me at all." So the parents say, "How can it be it didn't bother you? I mean, these are terrible things." He says, "Listen, it doesn't bother me because I don't plan to marry her." So what's the point? Is people don't care about things that don't matter to them, right? You don't care. So she has all these things. She's a fascinating human being to meet, right? Fascinating. I was fascinated by this person. If you don't have to deal with this person day in, day out, it doesn't bother you, right? And so today we're going to talk about there is something else we should care about when we do a mitzvah. Till now, we've been speaking about, one second, Menachem. Yeah. Okay. All right. So there's one thing that there's one thing. Yeah. We just spent an entire chapter so far, chapter 41, discussing how we have to want to do the mitzvah because we have to understand, we have to serve God, we have to love God. He's going to add another thing that one should have in mind, that one should care about when one does a mitzvah. And even though it may not affect you personally right now, you should care about it. And that is to make a union between God. Sounds weird, right? To make a union between God. What does that mean? That means like this. God has many different manifestations, right? We actually spoke about another class. We spoke about the concept of godliness, right? Godliness. There's God himself, but then there's godliness. Godliness means the shine, the ray, the light of God, okay? Now, in the light and manifestation of God, there are different manifestations of that. There's the manifestation of God that is more generally we call the Shekinah. That's the light of God that is resting. That means it gets very much imbued within this world. It's very much the light of God. We also call it Mamale Kalam, and it fills up the world. It's the light of God that's tailor-made for everything. It helps the grass grow. It helps your hands move. We spoke about it, for example, in a human body, right? We spoke about how there's the soul that vivifies every specific part of your body, and then there's the part of your soul that gives you general life. Similarly, God has his Shekinah. That's the light of God that rests, that becomes very much connected with everything around it. And then there's what's called the light of God, which we can call Hakadosh Baruch Hu. You could raise your hand or post in the comments if you've heard of the name of God, what we call God, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Anybody heard of Hakadosh Baruch Hu? So a lot of songs. Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Yes,
Yeah.
Beth?
Yes, I am.
You've heard it, yeah. So Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Kutchabrichu. So the first word there is Kadosh. Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. What does holy mean? Does anybody know what the word holy means? Kadosh. Kadosh has another meaning. Anybody knows what else Kadosh means?
Does it mean full?
No, no, no. Think of what makes something holy,
Extreme
typically.
spiritual.
God consciousness.
Okay, we're getting there. What makes something holy is a separation, right? If you think of a human being that's holy, you think of someone who is kind of, a step above the rest of us, separate, a little separate from the world. It's a holy person. Holiness means separation. When we start off Shabbat, we make Kiddush. We're, so to speak, separating from the week. Kiddush is holiness, where we're elevating, we're separating from the week. And then when we finish Shabbat, we make another blessing. What's that blessing called?
It's Havdalah.
Havdalah. Havdalah is another word for separation, except this time it's the separation going a step down, right? We're going from the holy to the mundane, okay? So again, Kiddush is going the step up. Havdalah is separation going the step down. That's why we smell the spices, because we're going a step down. We're going to miss out the holiness, so we have to smell a spice to revive us. So that's what Hakadosh Baruch Hu means. So Hakadosh Baruch Hu is the manifestation of God that is very separate, very high, very sublime, right? The sublime light of God, you might call it, right? So again, we have the Shekinah. Shekinah means God's presence as He is manifest. Shekinah means to rest. And then we have God's presence, Kudsha B'richu, God's presence as He is very separate, okay, kind of more pure. And what we want to do is we want to merge these two manifestations or lights of God. And when we finish that job of merging these two lights, ultimately the Mashiach is going to come. That's what we're getting to over here. And every time we do a mitzvah, we're merging these two lights of God. Why? Because our souls come from the Shekinah, come from God's manifest light. As we see, we are manifest in this world. And the Kudsha B'richu, the separateness, the light of God that is separate, is the source of Torah and mitzvot. And therefore, when a Jew does Torah and mitzvot, he is causing a unification of God's manifest light with God's sublime light, and which is ultimately God's intention in creation of the world, to merge these two lights, which will ultimately bring about the Mashiach. Because God's manifest light, the Shekinah, allows the world to remain as it is. When we merge God's sublime light with the manifest light, then even the manifest world becomes a sublime world. That's really the goal. Mashiach comes, the world will be merged with the sublime light of God, remaining also a world. That's the trick, to have a world that has God's manifest light, to have a world that remains very physical, but also sublime at the same time. That's the trick of Mashiach, of the third temple, for which we pray for every single day. Which is also why, by the way, I know it was big news. Tucker Carlson was talking about how, well, I shouldn't mention his name, but some media personnel was talking about how Chabad is, into building the third temple, and that's why they started the war with Iran. And he's right, we're into building the third temple. However, the tradition is that God is going to build that temple, because in order to truly have this merging of God's sublime light with the manifest light, then that temple has to come from God in order for that sublime light to be here. So that's why the third temple comes from heaven, comes from God. We're not going to build it. So whatever anybody thinks, we're working to bring the third temple, but even if we were to take control over the Temple Mount today, we would not build the third temple. It's for God to build it, because when God built that temple, it's going to be the merging of God's manifest light with God's sublime light. Which they're both okay. So let us read this inside. Oh, so sorry. So where am I getting with all this? The point is that when you do a mitzvah, you should not only think about how you want to get close to God, which is love. You should not only think about how God is king and you need to listen to him, which is reverence. You should also be thinking about what your mitzvah accomplishes, even though maybe it doesn't affect you personally right now. Obviously, when Mashiach comes, it will. But you should be thinking about what your mitzvah accomplishes. Okay, so again, you can do a mitzvah for your personal connection to God. You can be doing a mitzvah for your personal reverence of God, but you could also be doing it for the mission and for what you're accomplishing. And what you're accomplishing is making that fusion of the divine light. Think about it as a soldier in an army. A soldier in an army might be serving an army because they love the king, or they might be afraid of the king. But then the soldier can also do what they're doing because they know what they're accomplishing. And all three of those are true things. And that's what he's going to argue over here, is that even after you have reverence and even after you have love, you should be thinking also about what you're accomplishing. So let's take a look. Let's take a look inside. So he says, up until this point, we have discussed love of God as a personal longing for connection. The Tanya will now expand to include how your soul root, which is intrinsically bound with the souls of all Israel, connects God on a communal level. So he says here, however, our sages of blessed memory have taught A person should never exclude himself from the community. In other words, don't just think about yourself. Think about what you're accomplishing. Think about the communal job. Therefore, when worshiping God, your intent should be, in addition to everything stated above in the chapter about love and reverence, you ought to have a further, more esoteric intent, to merge with and attach God not only to your own particular soul, but also to your divine soul source, which is one and the same as the source of the souls of all Israel, which is known as the Shekinah. The soul has different layers and identities. Sometimes we stress its direct connection to God, saying it is a piece of God above. But in this chapter, we're discussing another element of your soul, its worldly compatibility. The fact that your soul fits in your body and speaks its language shows that it has a worldly side. The worldly side of your soul is rooted in a divine energy that has been diminished and veiled so as to be compatible with the world, and is what I kept calling the Shekinah. So the fact that your soul can come into your body is because you have that ability to the Shekinah. I'm just trying to get this to back up. Okay, it's backing up. I just need this. Okay. The source of the worldly side of your soul is the breaths of his mouth. When speaking of inner identity of your soul, how it is a piece of God, the Tanya stresses how God blew into the nostrils of breath. 1 second to get what he's saying. I'll need to get the next page up. Go here. 1 second. Refreshing. All right, we're going to be on page 510. Right, 510. No, we're going to be on page 5. What page are we going to be on? 511. 511. Let's share the screen again. Oh, wow, we're running up against time. Okay. From the innermost depths of the being. Okay, but since we're speaking this chapter about the worldly layer of the soul, the Tanya quotes a different verse. With the breath of his mouth, all their hosts were made. A verse which speaks of more superficial elements of creation. The source of the worldly layer of the soul is from the Shekinah. So I'm gonna skip around here, due to the fact that it inhibits and is enmeshed in all the worlds, giving them life and sustain them all. And it is precisely this Shekinah, worldly energy, from which power flows to you to physically speak the words when you speak words of Torah, or the power to perform the act when you perform a particular mitzvah. But since the Torah mitzvah also expresses an undiminished otherworldly light of God's will, which I call the Kudsha B'richu, there's a merging here of the worldly power used to perform the mitzvah, the Shekinah, and its otherworldly light, divine will, called Kudsha B'richu. And that's because the observance of Torah mitzvahs pulls the undiminished, blessed, infinite light, the Kudsha B'richu, Kadosh Baruch Hu, downwards into all the worlds, including this physical world, since the blessed, infinite light is present within the Torah mitzvos. And when you observe the Torah mitzvos, your intention should be that God's infinite light be pulled down into the worldly source of your soul and into the worldly source of all the souls of Israel to merge them together. So what he's saying is, this is why we say before we do a mitzvah, we say L'Shem Yichud Kudsha B'richu Shechinte. We say it in the morning prayers before the Baruch Shamar prayer. We say, I'm doing this mitzvah in order to unify Kudsha B'richu, the holy, blessed one, and his Shekinah, because that is what a mitzvah does. A mitzvah merges God's manifest light with God's sublime light. As will be explained later at length, the meaning of this merging, look there. The idea doesn't seem to be elaborated at length anywhere else in Tanya, but see chapter 46 at length. Okay. And this is the meaning of the kabbalistic Havana said before the observance of the mitzvahs, and worship is being done for the sake of the merging of the Blessed Holy One and his Shekinah in the name of all Israel. The brief kabbalistic Kavanah sums up our whole discussion in one succinct phrase. You are conscious that through this mitzvah, you are going to pull down the infinite light of the Blessed and Infinite Holy One into the Shekinah, thereby invigorating the souls of all Israel by connecting them with the otherworldly light. And this kavanah, this intention, forms this part of the second wing of every mitzvah. In our bird analogy, the love of God. Love is a feeling that you want to come close to God, and on the level of communal conscious, it's the feeling that you want to draw the root of all souls close to God. So not only you want to get close to God, but you want everyone and everything to get close to God. So I know I ran through that quickly, but let me summarize what we said in this chapter today. We said number one is that even if your reverence of God is only stuck in your mind, and it's not even excitement of the mind, you just know that God is watching, that is a certain level of reverence. because you're fearing God like you fear another human being, which means you will not act out in the presence of another human being. So even that basic reverence is good. But then we discussed how one needs to have love, because otherwise you don't have the second wing. We discussed how when serving God, we need to do things that might be against our nature. But we discussed that general love means my personal desire to connect to God. But then we added, when one does a mitzvah, one should also have in mind that the general concept is that me as a soul, which is the Shekinah, and the mitzvah, which is Kudsha Brichu, God's sublime light, are becoming merged. And so when I do a mitzvah, I'm not only accomplishing for myself, but I'm accomplishing for all Jewish people and for the entire world a merging of these two lights. And Be'ezrat Hashem, when these lights will be merged totally, then the Mashiach will come. And that is why before we do mitzvah, we say L'Shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu Shchinte. If you want to know where in the blue siddur it is, I can send it to you. You can ask me after the class. But all right, we'll have to end here. And thank you for coming. And I'll stick on for a couple more minutes because I did that last part quick.